Good afternoon, everyone. Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to our fourth webinar. Joining us today are panelists who require no introduction. I'm also joined by my co-host, Ibrahim, today, who'll be helping follow up on some of our earlier conversations that we've been having on what is an incredible game-changing journey in the startup entrepreneur space.
Jazakallah khair, Zubair. Well, yes, as you said, we're hosting this thought leadership series that engages in entrepreneurs and investors and policymakers on the same platform on a kind of peer-to-peer basis to discuss these kind of thought-provoking themes that we've been looking at over the last series of seminars. And the idea is that we want to create a new wave of Muslim entrepreneurs that are shaping the global halal economy.
Thanks, Ibrahim. Yeah, so this series has been dubbed Reflections, and it's the world's first online and offline entrepreneurial hub, where our panelists will share their insights and their expertise.
And Zubair, I think the idea is, I'm coming in as a co-host midway through the series, that we answer the questions that every startup co-founder has when they're going through their journey and they're itching to ask these questions to people who can potentially answer them, and these can be of real values to these relationships, and getting to the the heart of the underlying issues and the deeper kind of thematic discussions that are often missed when we talk about these things. And so we'll be talking about things like impact, SDGs, and of course access to funding. And we'll also be looking at women empowerment, economic empowerment, inclusion, wider diversity, and of course sustainability and other ESG kind of topics.
Great, fantastic. And all of these conversations culminate in a plenary of intellect, expertise, and talent in December at the London Excel within the Halal Economic Conference.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. And so let's get started then. Let's get into the questions. We already have a list of questions, but our listeners can use the Q&A tabs to ask questions, which will come through to myself and Zubair, and we'll put them to the panel. And if we can ask you to keep your questions to the point, to which panelists can address the question directly. Let's jump straight in.
Great. So today we have champions who've navigated this journey themselves. Their bios are on the LinkedIn profiles we've already shared. But a warm welcome to Haris, Ali, Abdullah, and obviously Shahed. We'll be asking you questions about emerging trends in the Islamic FinTech world. What do you believe investors look out for in FinTech entrepreneurs and startups? And we'll be discussing if there's a set formula or a pattern that you as our panelists follow or look out for, or is there this notion of a gut feeling really involved here? Okay, so I'll kick off with the first question, I think, and this is a standard question that we ask all of our guests. So if you take it in turn, ethical companies have blossomed across the world in recent years, from fair trade and clothing to issue-driven social projects. Do you think this is no coincidence that halal businesses have bloomed simultaneously? So Haris, to you first.
My apologies, I realized I was on mute for a second. I think it might be a coincidence, actually, which might not be the majority view. And the reason I say that is because I think halal economy has grown in line with demographics. But in other words, there are 1.8 billion Muslims in the world and rising very rapidly. But actually, I think that the global ethical economy has been growing in line with UN SDGs, with a non-Muslim consumer sentiment, things like climate change. Where is the Muslim Greta Thunberg, for example? I think, it's not unfair to say that Muslims generally are followers, not leaders, at least today. Maybe that wasn't the case 500 years ago, but today we are very much catching up with the rest of the world. So I'm not sure that, and obviously there are huge overlaps between the halal economy and the ethical economy, but I don't think that the growth of the two together are actually linked. And I think it's time to bring that link together by, for example, having Islamic finance, which has an ESG overlay, environmental, social, and governance concerns. And that hasn't happened yet.
Okay, interesting point. Now I'm going to ask Shahed a question that links to that a little bit later. But Ali, do you want to give your thoughts on that?
No, I broadly agree with Harris, and I do think demographic plays a big role. And I think specifically more in the Western societies, we get a lot of more Muslims here, especially migrating in. So in terms of seeing more Muslim entrepreneurs, more Muslims building the halal economy, it's going to increase and it's going to grow the more Muslims we have in the Western society. So it's one of the things time and work get on the world as
okay. Abdul, your thoughts?
So I somewhat disagree. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it's a very, very sort of deliberate evolution that's based on current circumstances around the world, current macro environment, what we've seen over the last decade in terms of the way business and more particularly finance has been developing, which is our area of expertise. I think post-financial crisis, there were a number of us that, or even beforehand, were looking at our careers and looking at ways in which we felt it wasn't really resonating with our values and looking for alternatives. And post-financial crisis, I think there was an opportunity to move towards things that were more aligned to our values. What we saw was the creation of really a reboot of the entrepreneurial environment, especially in mainstream finance centers like London and New York. I agree with Harris's point that, you know, Muslims are not necessarily leaders, we're followers. So, you know, we followed very much what's happening in the conventional space. That's where the initial uptake was. But, you know, Muslim entrepreneurs were involved in that. It may not have been building ethical or halal businesses as such, but were moving more into the entrepreneurial sphere. And thereafter, we then saw more ideas coming out, having seen conventional ideas take off for the halal economy. And so I think it's been a very deliberate move. I think the enabling environment around it has really been supported by government and other institutions that are helping entrepreneurship. And I think finance was, for me, the sort of the lead in, but we've certainly seen other areas of the halal economy developing once we've seen that uptake in finance. And I think part of that is to do with connecting with like-minded communities as well. So once you see entrepreneurs in other parts of the world doing things that match your values, then there's really a mindset change for others who are, you know, of the entrepreneurial mindset to say, well, if they can do it, why can't we? Or why can't we do it for our community? Or why can't we do it in our sector?
Great, some valuable insights there. Shahed, your thoughts?
Well, just to tie everyone together, I actually think it's a little bit of all of it. I mean, what we've had is, I think, a convergence that's been happening over the last 10 years, where you have these two somewhat independent kind of ethical systems start to interact with each other. So, for example, like one of the things that I noticed on Zabihah over the last 20 years is how demand for halal at some point started intersecting with demand for organic. And then they started actually melding and merging, where a lot of people now wouldn't consider something that's halal to be truly halal if it wasn't also organic. And so as these things cross-pollinate, as I think they should, I mean, I think we need to get out of this idea that we're in this kind of separate, unique bubble that has nothing to learn from the mainstream. We do. And as a matter of fact, then the next step is, of course, does the mainstream have something to learn from us? Which I think we all agree that that's the case. But I think this convergence has been good for us. I think that Muslim consumers are becoming more demanding, not just on the halal aspect of their goods and services, but also of the mainstream ethical demands. So I think it's all a good thing.
Great, fantastic. I think there's a. So I was just going to say that I think there's an opportunity to use this as a catalyst And there's a couple of questions that are coming through there, which I'm going to ask you later. But Ibrahim, if I just turn over to you and you can carry on.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting theme. So I was going to ask you about, whether or not you think halal and Islamic financing is enabling the growth of Muslim businesses and the halal economy. But as a kind of related question to that, because I think the obvious answer to that question is that it is in some way or another. But an interesting kind of addition to that that I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on, and a lot of you have touched on this idea, is, well, what is the the Islamic finance world, or the halal finance world, or the Islamic venture capitalist, or the Islamic angel? What are the kind of things that we can contribute to the mainstream industry in this, and what does that look like? So maybe, I don't know if we go back to you, Haris, on this.
I think you're quite right that Islamic finance has not really enabled social inclusion. It hasn't financed SMEs. It hasn't been a lubricant for the Islamic economy. To date, Islamic finance has mostly been Islamic banking, and Islamic banking has been a lot about Gulf institutions buying real estate in the UK and the US, or financing 7-star hotels or luxury apartments. So that's not really very socially inclusive. And I think what's happening at the grassroots level now is we're seeing certain initiatives come up. So in my case, it's been things like the UK Islamic FinTech Panel. It's been things like the IE5 Accelerator, which have acted as grassroots organizations and advisory firms to help early stage halal companies and Islamic economy companies and ethical companies which share the same values develop and grow. And that's a very recent phenomenon. So I think that's starting to happen now. And that's why we're starting to see this intersection of the Islamic economy and ethical, ESG, SDGs, that kind of thing. But it is a very, very recent thing. And we don't have the skill set within our own community to be able to do sophisticated analysis, venture capital investment, and so on. And we're still turning to the traditional venture capital investors like Silicon Valley and saying, here's this value proposition in the Islamic economy. Are you interested? And it's kind of difficult for them to get their heads around that, because it's not something that they've seen before.
Jazakallah khair. And before I move on to Ali, I just wanted to chuck in a thought about so the kind of things I was thinking about here was the fund structures that we use, the kind of innovative solutions that we could come up with. So the classic venture fund comes in, gets a whole bunch of shares, preference shares, options of various kinds. But then there's this new kind of innovative VC funding that's coming along, which is much more focused on revenue shares or invoice financing, financing of cash flows. And the Islamic world has a whole bunch of quite interesting, quite well thought out concepts on this. So that was kind of some of my thoughts on this, but I won't elaborate further. I just want to kind of carry that conversation on here. Ali, maybe if we could come to you and get your thoughts on what we've been discussing.
No, I agree. Islamic finance hasn't done much to sort of like support the average Mohammed walking down the street, or even the average person that has a shop or a corner shop. And it's traditionally because it's those kind of like venture capital kind of investments is scary. And as Haris mentioned, we're still going to a lot of non-Muslim people trying to explain what the reasoning behind it is. Like I sat down with VC firms that are predominantly non-Muslim, middle-aged white men who are looking at me like, so there's this whole world of Islamic finance that exists. We didn't really know about this. And I'm like, yeah, it's quite big. There's a lot of Muslims and they kind of bank quite differently. And they sort of like look at you with their googly eye thinking, this doesn't, I've never heard of this, just coming across it right now. So I think there is a level of maturity. The fact that there was a lot of entrepreneurs starting up right now, and the fact that inshallah a lot of them would get some sort of success from what they're doing right now, to then to be able to give back to the community and then be in that position of understanding to say, hey, and give feedback in terms of this is the journey that I took, but also have the ability to invest back into the community. And in terms of the different types of investment that you talked about, one of the companies that are quite innovative in that is they're called ClearBank, and they're kind of focus on more of like revenue based funding, which is really exciting. But the challenges then comes around digitalization, because a lot of their ways that they understand and track, and a lot of these digital companies that fund smaller companies do is they track your activities, internet activities. You know, they look at how much invoices you're making, whereas you can't transition that now back to the corner shop because they have a lot of receipts. They're mainly cash based. So again, it's about identifying how do we make the system more inclusive, and I think it's on us to try and identify that. And there is no one solution for it. It's going to take many.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got plenty of questions coming in, and they kind of dip into different areas and come back full circle. So we'll have to keep you on your toes. So for startups and policymakers trying to make sense of Islamic financial instruments, what is this in reality? And does it make any difference? So we're looking at, you know, will it help support guarantees or reduce risk? Abdul, if you can perhaps answer that one.
Yeah, I think, I mean, most of my experience is based here in the UK, and I think the top level policymakers have an understanding of Islamic finance. And I know Harris is much better versed in dealing with them from the first iteration of Islamic finance. But in my experience, they understand Islamic finance to a very high level, and that's pretty much it. I think where we as an industry get bogged down is in the dogma of the terminology, the legal contracts. And whilst a lot of work has been done in that space and it's been useful in turning theory into practice, I broadly agree with the sentiment that, you know, we're not really serving the consumer. And I think that's because Islamic finance, or Islamic banking more specifically, has not been designed as a consumer-led service. And so what we're starting to see now with entrepreneurs in the Islamic fintech space is they are much more consumer-led. So my sort of primary involvement with Islamic fintech is on the board of the recognized Islamic fintech out of the UK, Yielders, which is a property investment crowdfunding platform. And really here we are trying to solve an unmet need. And the unmet need is that those who are of faith or no faith that don't want to invest in a leveraged fashion don't have many opportunities to make a competitive return. And we've solved that by utilizing a regulatory framework that exists in the conventional space, which is crowdfunding, but building a business from the ground up that is inherently Sharia compliant. But the really important thing is we haven't marketed it as Sharia compliant. The name is an English name, not an Arabic name. We market to a specific channel of Muslim consumers as being Sharia compliant. We don't mass market as being halal or Sharia compliant. And that's because our belief is that this is a better product built on the tenets of the Sharia, and it is mass market applicable. And we need to demonstrate that. There will be a consumer set that wants us to see, us to demonstrate that this is Sharia compliant, but there'll be another consumer set, and indeed the Muslim consumer set, that will judge us on our returns and how competitive we are and how transparent and how good we are at servicing the consumer. And so when you bring all those factors in, I think, you need to start thinking about how you pitch startups to investors, and also the Islamic finance space to policymakers. And I think it's more about consumer fairness, and ultimately policymakers and regulators care about, are you treating the consumer fairly, and is this good for the consumer and the wider industry? And I think if you can demonstrate those aspects of what we're trying to do, I think that goes a much longer way than saying this is halal and it serves a global consumer base of over 1 billion. I think that that's just too high level and doesn't really hit the right incentives for policymakers. But if you demonstrate, especially in the current climate, that this is an alternative finance mechanism that is fairer, more transparent, can be as competitive as a product as other finance products, I think those things go a lot further in that discussion.
All right, thanks for that. Harris, over to you.
Abdul's absolutely right. The issue with the industry is that it's not addressing problems at the grassroots level, and the culture needs to change. From a regulatory perspective, Islamic finance has very much had to follow the same framework that conventional finances have to follow. And that's not the fault of the banks, and that's not the fault of the regulators. That's just the way the law works, and that's the way central bankers work. But my personal view is I'm bored with Islamic banking. It just hasn't achieved what it set out to achieve, the social impact. And I think that the Islamic banking industry has now ended up with a bunch of charlatans who, plied the conference circuit, talking platitudinous nonsense and awarding themselves gongs, but actually not solving the problems. And I think if you ask them, what is the nature of money, they would really struggle to give an understandable response. And I think because they don't understand the essence of the Islamic economy and that Islamic finance is a lubricant for that economy, they've missed the point, and they're not producing solutions to the problems that consumers have. What's happening in the tech world is that grassroots startups are addressing many of those problems, and they're trying to solve them.
And just to jump in on that, I think there's a really interesting question here, and that's, Abdul, Haseeb, you mentioned this as well, which was, to get scale here, a lot of us are based in the UK, and a lot of us are involved in, Islamic fintechs and the like. To get scale, you need to address the wider mainstream market. And, you need to, with Ali, you've got your Niyah, which is a Sharia compliant bank. We've got yielders. We've got the accelerator, and in America we've got this fund that's focused on the Muslim economy. Do you think that the mainstream audience really will buy into this idea of having no interest, and will buy into this idea of for example in the property space, going for the equity in the property rather than the loan approach? I mean, this is just something I've been mulling over myself, so it'd be really interesting to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think maybe I can jump in first. I think it's a difficult sell because our entire financial system and our tax system is based on favoring leverage. So anyone who is purely returns focused will always carry that argument that I can make more with leverage. However, I think if you demonstrate that without leverage you can still be competitive, and that's where that's the make or break of any business, is actually you've got to turn a profit. And conversely, a lot of the Islamic banks in the UK actually struggle to make a profit, or have struggled over the last few years. If you can demonstrate that, and you can demonstrate the fairness of it to the consumer, especially on the downside. So Islamic finance talks a very good game on the upside about how we're fairer for everybody, but on the downside, they always sort of gloss over who actually holds the risk and takes the loss. And that's where any Islamic instrument for me falls apart in the traditional Islamic finance space. If you can demonstrate that, I think you will get mass market appeal, and then it's more about your branding and how you actually market to that audience. So to give you a view, a fair chunk of the yielders investors are non-Muslim, and they like the fact that we provide transparency and ownership, and they like the fact that our tech solution is best in class, that we can provide returns on a monthly basis. They value that over other property investment platforms who can't do that. And they also like the fact that we're not leveraged. And when we explain to them how that insulates us against property market shocks, it makes sense to them. They don't necessarily need to be a Muslim to understand that or value that. But as even as a returns focused investor, that makes sense for them. And I think it's all about how you market that to them. If you go off and market that, from the Sharia as a starting point, and demonstrate how you're halal before you get into the actual economics of it, I think you will be pigeonholing yourself to a Muslim-only audience. So it's really about the framing to the relevant audiences, I think.
Okay, great stuff. Okay, so next question that we have, Shahed, this is for you, I think, first, and then I'll come back to Ali, and then Haris, and then Abdul, in that order. So there's a digital economy, there's new technology, there's innovation, as we know, and there's cryptocurrency. So as people who have insight into the banking arena, Islamic finance, and as investors in business, where do you see fintech fitting in the halal/ethical space as enabling inclusion and addressing some of the gaps in society? So for example, poverty and gender issues. So Shahed, for you first.
Yeah, no, first of all, I just want to thank everyone who's been speaking right now, because it really does speak to me. You know, everything that you're saying, I totally agree with. And I actually want to elevate it a little bit more. I think we have a very short runway where if we do not, we've been talking about Islamic finance, we've been talking about all these benefits, and frankly, in the next 5 or 10 years, if we don't actually prove that we can do this, we're going to relegate ourselves, this Islamic space broadly will just become this kind of niche market space that people will, you know, like the kiddie table at a party, you know, well, let's give them their little things that make them happy. And meanwhile, the rest of us in the mainstream will do the big things. And I think we're really in a danger of putting ourselves in that space if we don't elevate our game. And what do I mean by that? I mean, first of all, you know, we have a motto, by us for everybody. Everything has to be designed so that it is consumable by the mainstream. They don't have to learn our terms. I want people to see a great product or service and then ask questions. Why is it so great? Dig a little bit below the surface. Oh, that's why, right? It should speak for ourselves. We shouldn't have to go out there and like explain why we bring something unique to the table. They should just see it, right? And you need to have this broad appeal. One of the problems that we've done in this space is that we talk about the tools more than we talk about the end product. Like I'll give you a couple examples. One is that, you know, like Haris had mentioned earlier, you know, this has really been shaped by people with a lot of money. I mean, it is easier to invest $10 million, $50 million in a hotel than to invest, you know, 100 investments of $100,000 in startups, 90% which will fail. The latter of which is what you need to build an ecosystem. Even if 90% of those startups fail, you're going to get, you're going to cultivate a group of professionals. You're going to cultivate a foundation on which success can be built. And so we really do need to kind of flip this. In terms of all these tools, I mean, look, as long as we keep ourselves isolated, we're not going to see what's happening in the mainstream. And one of the things that we're really trying to do is we're trying to keep one foot solidly in the mainstream, where we see what are the existing trends, what are people trying to disrupt, how can we add to that, how can we accelerate that. The great dilemma I see in this space is that, you know, when you take a Muslim and put them in the mainstream, they shoot right to the top. They're professional, they add to the mainstream. When you pull them out into this separate place, we all of a sudden, the bar lowers, right? And we really shouldn't settle for that, right? I mean, there's no reason we can't come with every bit of the A game that we bring when we're in the mainstream, and then add a plus to that. And so in terms of like these tools, one of the things that we're really trying to wrap our head around is access. Is you know, if you look at the broader Muslim world, there's such an imbalance of haves and have-nots. There's such a, I mean, just look at our panel. I mean, I'm sorry to have to bring this up, but we're all men, right? Where are the women in the fintech space? And part of that is that we've been kind of pushing women into this space of the modest fashion and things like that, which are kind of like the stereotypical gender things. I want to see more women in this space, because if we don't have that in the fintech space, it's not going to match the success of the mainstream. It just isn't. And so we should take a close look at all these tools. You know, I'm a little bit of a crypto skeptic myself. I'll always stay open to the idea. The main reason I am is quite simply, and I'm not judging it by the tool, I'm judging it by the first responders to that tool. And frankly, a lot of the first responders to that tool are people who want something for nothing, are people who are not, these are the people who are trying to go into it and make a quick buck. And frankly, until that space shakes out all these people, and you get people who are in there who are truly asking, like, how is this going to percolate this mass benefit to the masses? And we get rid of the scams, and we get rid of the, you know, people losing their shirt. At that point, I'll give it some credibility. We should always keep an open mind about all these things. I'm a much bigger believer in blockchain, for example. But we have to keep an open mind about all of these. I'm not gonna write off any of these different tools.
Haris, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I thought we were going to do the order of Ali next, and then me. Happy to, up to you, Ali, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure if Ali was. Ali, do you want to go next? Doesn't matter.
The floor is yours.
Like
Okay, so Shahed, some really fantastic points there. How funny that you mentioned the gender balance on this panel, because it's the first thing I thought of when I saw the videos on my screen. And if we as an industry are serious about social inclusion and diversity, then that's a start. We've got to have some gender balance. And I'm trying to push at least one of my teenage daughters into computer science. I don't know whether she's going to go for it, but I really hope she does, because that's absolutely the future. On the subject of crypto, I think there's a lot of misinformation about this, and I've written extensively on the subject. It's often a lot of misinformation that's peddled by poorly informed scholars, which is a real shame, because they are influential in our community. I also think that the vast majority of so-called Sharia compliant cryptocurrency is just nonsense, especially the ones that tend to talk about the necessity to have gold backing. Sharia does not require this, but for some reason it's become perceived, it's become common wisdom that that's the case. And again, ironically, I'm a big advocate of Bitcoin because I happen to think that it fulfills the function of money from an Islamic perspective better than anything else, including gold, by the way. It's a kind of a gold 2.0. It's the most halal form of money that I've seen. And it was, ironically created most likely by non-Muslims. And yet we've kind of ignored this very important point, because it addresses all of the aspects of the nature of money which we as Muslims need to address. A lot of great points there. I also agree that we have a very short runway. We have very short lives, not just personally, but as far as the industry is concerned. And the moment there's a downturn, or the moment that we don't deliver, the industry is going to turn away from us. So it's incumbent on us to succeed very, very quickly. And I have been reaching out to, institutions in the Islamic world to help fund Islamic fintechs. And it's been an uphill battle, because they just simply don't get it. We have to find another source. I can't tell you what that source is. Abdul and I are working on that right now. But, I think we have to succeed very, very soon. And we need to get this message out.
Thanks.
I don't really have a lot to add on, but apart from, I think fintech can play a really big role in terms of inclusion and accessibility. I think a lot of people, it's technology, it's helping a lot of people get access to things that they never had access to before. And predominantly in the Muslim society, we're sort of just about describing technology, the way to use the technology. I mean, the broader people, those that are not in technology every day. So what I'm really excited about is how fintech can broaden that scope even more to help everyday Muslims understand how technology and fintech can help their lives. So for example, instead of having to go to an accountant, being able to automate your taxes, being able to, a lot of the things that you wouldn't be able to do necessarily take you time, to give you that time back so you can spend that time on family, on things that matter to you more. So I think in terms of fintech, there is a lot more we can do in inclusion, getting people into the financial state that they want to be in, but also helping understand the journey that someone goes through in their lives. They require different financial services as when they graduate, to when they first get married, to when they have a child. Their financial situation is going to change. And I think at the moment in time, we don't have a sort of I wouldn't say we are Sharia compliant, but I would say a Islamic financial institution that helps you throughout that lifestyle journey as you go from being a graduate to being a pension. And I think that's sort of what's missing. And I think over the next couple of years, and in that short runway that we have, we're going to see a lot of companies like Yielders, and we're going to see companies like Niyah and other ones that are going to come up and sort of integrate together to provide that ecosystem for the Muslim person to say, hey, here's a current account that you can save you can receive your money, but at the same time, if you want to put money aside, why don't you put 100 aside every month into Yielders so that you can start making a portfolio of investments. So I think we are going to see a lot of big change, but we have to be the catalyst for that change.
So a couple of points I want to pick up on there. So certainly on the inclusion point, yes, I think we all need to do a better job of having, more female representation at things like this podcast. you know, what are we doing to enable inclusion? Well, actually, at Yielders, you know, we had the opposite problem. We initially had most of our clientele were female. We had an imbalance of more female users than male users, and that sort of evened out over our 3 years. Why was that? Well, I think finance generally is designed to be confusing. The terminology we use is confusing. We overcomplicate things just so bankers can get away with doing things that, you know, people don't challenge them on because they feel stupid in questioning it. And I think, you know, on the flip side, what we're seeing now with a lot of fintechs is because we're trying to address a more inclusive audience or do it in a more inclusive way, we simplify our language, we talk more plainly, we make it more accessible. And I think Ali raised a good point. A lot of great financial products you can't access because you need to be investing thousands to get access to them. Whereas a lot of fintechs will start with you know, small token amounts that you can invest from, get some experience, get more comfortable with the product before you start putting more money in. And I think the transparent nature of the language and the way in which you allow access really helps to build that trust, and that I think makes you more inclusive, and that has certainly been my experience. I think you know, we touched on the crypto topic, and there was a question earlier by Ibrahim about, you know, what do we need to do to get policymakers more comfortable. Part of the work I do is around you know, globally looking at codes of conduct and standards within the crypto asset or digital asset space in another company that I'm involved in. And really, I agree with a lot of the comments about, you know, the crypto space. There's a whole range of actors, good and bad. And what we are trying to do is really demonstrate to the regulatory community globally that there are very credible actors in this space that are doing things that will promote inclusion and find use cases for this technology beyond what we see today. But they need to be given room to innovate. And what you can't do is actually just shut everything down because, you know, in one part of the world, crypto is being used for a certain thing or in a certain way. And so we work more collaboratively with the community and policymakers to really help them understand where this is going, what the opportunities are, how best to regulate it right now, how to future-proof their regulation, and really work to help advance that community. And that's, I think, some of the work that, you know, both Haris and I do in Islamic finance and elsewhere in terms of, you know, community-led policy advocacy, as we call it. So it's not necessarily lobbying, but advocacy for a innovation community. And we've done that in the Islamic finance space. We're doing that in the crypto space as well. So I think, you know, it's all trending in the right direction from an inclusivity point of view. I think the technologies, certain technologies will help that and enable that. The way fintechs address their market will enable that as well. Personally, I don't think it's happening fast enough. I think more can be done, and we all strive to do better, I think.
Okay, great. Ibrahim, over to you.
Sorry, I was on mute. So I was thinking about, you know, a counterpoint to this. So I know we've discussed here that there needs to be an element of addressing the mainstream and adding value to the mainstream within the Islamic, you know, fintech world. But is there also a space to be, you know, a truly kind of Islamic fintech world in the sense that you're really focusing in on the Muslim economy and the Muslim community? So I'm talking about things like, I mean, you know, I was thinking about Islamic Finance Guru itself. I was thinking about Zakat kind of, you know, apps and, you know, functions that that translate Zakat from the person who's paying to the person who needs to receive it, and those kind of, you know, startups or those kind of companies. Do you think there's a space for that? And if so, how does that need to be kind of, you know, what's the messaging around that to be able to properly resonate with both Muslims but also the mainstream, if you're looking for mainstream investors? Maybe if we could go to Shahed for that first.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. I mean, I'm a big believer in doing something that is beneficial to the mainstream, but I'm also co-founder of Zakatify, this app that lets you kind of manage your zakat donations and have it automatically withdrawn from your bank account and distributed to zakat eligible charities. Now, what the interesting thing about that app is that we have an exclusive relationship with PayPal, who's actually had to build technology to enable what we were trying to do because it hadn't been done before for anybody. And what that should tell you is that is what our logical next step is that we're doing the exact same product for the mainstream, right? And we basically are using the Muslim market as kind of a test market. There are different motivations for Muslims to do charitable donations than the mainstream, so they're going to have to be different. But that's a perfect example of doing something that is driven by our values, that's driven by our specific community needs, but it actually has a spillover effect of being beneficial to the mainstream. And so that means I think you can do both. I think you can be very hyper localized to what Muslims specifically want, but borrow from that, especially if you're being innovative about it, borrow from that and show it to the rest of the world and say, you might be able to benefit from this as well.
Interesting.
I've got another question. It kind of goes back to the whole Islamic ethical doing good debate, and I know that kind of sits on a fine line. Do we feel there's a shortage of Islamic or ethical focused startups, or is there a dearth of incubator or accelerator programs dedicated to this niche? Abdul, you're smiling, so let me start with you.
I would say no. I think we're starting to see a real boom, and I think my eyes were quite pleasantly opened at the Global Islamic Economy Summit in Dubai last year, where for the first time I saw people much younger than myself who are entrepreneurs coming in with halal economy solutions, and I think that was a real breath of fresh air, and it's started new communities around the halal economy, which for people that haven't been in the working environment for very long, but are at the very beginning of their career thinking about what they want to do that's more aligned to their values, rather than some of us who've spent a decade or more in the conventional space and then found a way out. So really encouraged by that, and I really hope that is very much the theme we see taken through to the Halal Expo in London as well.
Thank you. Shahed, do you have any points?
Yeah, no, I think I've seen the exact same thing. I think as the current generation of entrepreneurs has a peer network that we didn't have. The first generation of these companies, we were kind of just doing this on our own. But now people can plug into global networks of people. People are much more willing to help each other as opposed to being competitive. We were a bit crabs in a barrel in the first kind of generation of this, but people are now realizing that we all sink or rise together. So I'm seeing that ethic among the younger entrepreneurs. They have access to a lot more of mentorship. I spend a lot of my time mentoring Muslim entrepreneurs, and the fact that they have access to people that, I every time I do it, I wish that I had that when I was starting out. So I'm actually a big believer, and they're wildly optimistic. They're in touch with the latest trends. They get the mainstream trends as well. So I'm very optimistic now that what that means is that we have to be that empowering group of people. We need to come forward with mentorship, access to capital, all of that stuff, so that they can bloom and we'll benefit too.
Great, thanks. Haris?
Yeah, echo those sentiments. Clearly, the ecosystem is just starting to develop now, and that's very helpful for the new generation of entrepreneurs. The bit that's still missing from the puzzle is funding. That remains a very, very difficult thing for halal economy entrepreneurs. And as I say, we're working on it, but it's a relatively slow process. And we are trying any channel that we can to try and attract financing for the Islamic economy.
Great. And Ali, your thoughts as a new entrepreneur?
I do feel like there is sort of some level of network and community, but not the same level of community that I've experienced when working in a conventional startup. So if I have a conventional startup idea that I want to do, there is so much network and people that you can tap into that you just meet that are working on these exciting things. But you don't get the same in the whole halal economy. And I think that's purely because it's a new economy, so sort of like not necessarily new, but it's sort of growing, and people are sort of starting to become more inclusive, more sharing, more to say, how can I help you? Hey, we spoke to these guys, we got investment from them, maybe you'd work for you. So kind of like those kind of communities are just starting up. I would like to see a lot more of those online and offline communities, so that we can share ideas, we can help each other grow. But again, we're right at the beginning, where the conventional space had many, many years on us. I think we're now starting to tap into that.
Great, fantastic. Ibrahim, do you want to add anything?
All I can say really is that I'm quite excited to see what Haris and Abdul come up with, because I think there's a real need here for this.
I was just about to say the same. Guys.
Yeah, I think
that you know, that there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on here. I think in the next 2 years, hopefully we'll be able to crack the kind of, you know, the funding puzzle. I think there's a lot of interested angels, a lot of interested high net worth Muslim, you know, angels and high net worths who get this space now. And you know, there's a waqf in the pipeline that I know that the Islamic Development Bank has backed. And I'm hoping that a portion of that will be able to be funded in you know, these kind of directions. I know there's a whole bunch of startups who are focusing on you know, debt financing, Sharia compliant debt financing. I think that could be a really good alternative to all of this stuff. And then I think there's you know, with people like Frost Capital, and to some extent people like Hamra Perks, and you know, a few people in the Middle East, there's VC funds for the Series A rounds. And Series B and C rounds, where they understand now that there's a real potential here, and people like you know, Muzmatch, Wahid Invest, and you know, Yielders have been kind of forerunners in this, that have hopefully paved the path for, you know, a new generation to come along and make it a lot easier for them, inshallah.
Great, fantastic. So I'm getting a sense that there's a direct link between fintech, social impact, and inclusion. And I'm glad the point was raised about having more women on the panel, and that's something that we're very open about and having part of the conversation. I'm also getting a sense that perhaps we're suggesting here that Islamic finance capital flows advance social impact. So that's an interesting kind of whole, the ESG, SDGs bubble that you talked about, Haris, as well. And that leads into some of our future conversations that we were having around social impact, impact investing, and obviously the SDGs. I think that's all we have time for today, actually. So I'd just like to say thank you to all our panelists and to everyone that tuned in on the live webinar. We've got our next one in 2 weeks' time. This webinar has been recorded, so you can listen again and forward on to your network. And we ask you to please include the hashtag Halal Economy and Halal Expo London. Haris, thank you. Ali, thank you. Abdul, thank you. And Shahed, thank you. Ibrahim, do you have any last words?
No, I think it's just been really, really fascinating to get, you know, such a quality bunch of people in one place. And I think that, you know, these kind of conversations are, you know, thank you to you guys for arranging this stuff, because I think these are valuable conversations, and we're all kind of tussling with the same issues, but from slightly different perspectives. So it's helpful to get that all in one room. So Jazakallah khair for doing that.
Great. Thank you for being my co-host today. We did miss Firoz, but I know he's listening in with his mentorship there. So we got some really valuable insights today, and we've brought people closer together. And that's exactly what this series is supposed to do. It's designed to become a strong community of global and socially conscious entrepreneurs, made up of seasoned investors from across the globe, impact and humanitarian focused investors, and the effervescent personalities that make up many of tomorrow's startups. So once again, thank you very much to all our panelists. And this is a message to those who are investors, startup founders, CEOs, or people with something to share, including policymakers. If you want to get a better understanding of this space, then get in touch with us through LinkedIn and we'll get you in on the conversation. So until next time, thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.